This video was preceded by two previous videos that I made, both shown on the screen and linked in the description box. And now that we've all seen the build-up, let's have some payoff, shall we? First, let me explain another concept to you using a hypothetical situation. Let's say we had a YouTuber named Cackling Crone whose business was failing and she started a GoFundMe fundraiser for that business. And another YouTuber named, Mini Mick Horseface, she gave $100 to that GoFundMe fundraiser. And then, 1 month later, Mini Mick Horseface was having financial problems herself because she was fired, and so Cackling Crone gave $100 back to her on her GoFundMe fundraiser. Now, most of us would understand that nobody benefited from those transactions because they came out to zero both ways because, $100 went this way, $100 went that way. It all adds up to zero. And we're going to call that a null transaction, where no money is being made by either party. But why would anyone engage in a relationship where they're giving money to a person and then that person is giving money back, thereby negating any of the giving? Well, there is one other thing that they're giving each other, and that is they're scratching each other's backs and making each other's causes look bigger than they are. It's a well-known psychological principle used by many a con man to flash the fact that other donors are giving money to a cause in order to entice more people to give more money to that cause, because people like to back a winner. Where am I going with this? Well, recently I engaged in a study of charitist contributions on the website Patreon. What I wanted to find out with this research was which group of people were using null transactions the most in order to inflate each other's Patreon accounts and make each other look bigger than they actually were. To inform my research, I asked my own audience to please name for me as many MRAs, SJWs, and Feminists that they could so that I could research all of their names on Patreon. And now, here's the results of my research. To help you understand the results, I'm going to put a legend on the bottom of the screen here. And that legend's going to have 3 colors. And that is red, yellow, and green. Now, green means that I can personally vouch for this person that they did not have any null transactions on Patreon. How? Well, I can either see all of the people that they are donating to on Patreon, or I can see that they are getting $0 on Patreon, thereby negating any chance of them being involved in a null transaction. The color yellow is not a bad user on Patreon. No, that's just somebody who I cannot tell who they are giving to because they are either giving to no one using Patreon or they have turned off the function on Patreon that shows everyone who they're giving to. So when you see green or yellow, my research did not find any wrongdoing by that person. Now when you see red, that actually denotes one of the bad guys. That is a null transaction that has been found out by my research. If a name was suggested in the comments of my previous video and they did not have a Patreon account, they are not being spoken of in this video. The snapshot of the internet where this research took place was March 3rd, 2016. All of the accounts that you've seen in this segment of the video, labeled either yellow or green, were not found to have done anything unethical on Patreon with their transactions. However, in my next segment, highlighted in red, I will be showing all of the null transactions that I found based on all of the submissions from my YouTube audience for names to research. And in this, you will see a network of people giving back and forth to each other like a giant spider web of null transactions to prop each other up. And you will see that these came from one of these camps, either the SJWs and Feminists or the MRAs. You can also see, based on all of the names that you've seen in yellow and green, plus the red ones to come, that this sample was pretty representative of the SJWs, Feminists, and MRAs on YouTube. An interesting project, should anyone want to undertake it, might be to show an infographic with how many times your $1 bill would be represented amongst the spider web that I'm about to show you if you were to give to any one of these people. The first people connected to this network that I'm going to show are still not guilty of any ethical wrongdoing that I can see. They're just on the outskirts of that network. And if you were going to use them as a starting point, you would start with one of these guys and end with the other, because they're not the bad guys, okay? And that would be Hebbet Meta, Coctopus, Steve Shives, or Randy Harper, okay? Those would be your beginning and end if you wanted to try to see how many times you could get a dollar bill to go all these different ways, okay? Now, on to the really bad guys. Let me just scoot over here so I can show these to you. The first bad guy on the list would be the heart of the spider's web, Matt Dillahunty, who is giving funds to Aaron Ra, and then Aaron Ra is giving funds back to him, and then Matt Dillahunty gives funds to Seth Andrews, who then gives funds back to him, and then Matt Dillahunty is giving funds to Team DeWitt, who's then giving funds back to him, and then Matt Dillahunty gives a couple of other people on Patreon some money. Next on the list would be Aaron Ra, who's giving funds to Seth Andrews, who's giving funds back to him, and then he's giving funds to Matt Dillahunty, who's giving funds back to him. Then he's giving funds to Philip Rose, who is the true Puka here on YouTube, who's then giving funds back to him, and then he's giving funds to Team DeWitt, who's giving funds back to him. The next name on our list of bad guys is the third member of the Unholy Trinity speaking tour, Seth Andrews, who is giving money to Non-Stamp Collector, who's also giving money back to him, and then Seth Andrews is giving money to Matt Dillahunty, who's giving money back to him, and then giving money to Aaron Ra, who's giving money back to him. All three of those first three bad guys are on a speaking tour together and giving money back and forth to each other, and also making thousands on Patreon, and we don't know if they're giving each other $1 symbolically, or hundreds of dollars, or even 1,000. We don't know. The next part of this network would be Healthy Addict, who is giving money to Emily Deedle, and then Emily Deedle is giving money back to her. And then we've got Rebecca Watson, who's giving money to Amy Davis Roth, who's also giving it back to her. And then we've got Philip Rose, who I just told you guys is giving money to Aaron Ra, who's then giving it back to him. Then we've got Team DeWitt, who has null transactions with Matt Dillahunty back and forth, then Aaron Ra back and forth, then the No Religion Required podcast back and forth. Next, we've got Non-Stamp Collector, who gives money to Matt Dillahunty, who then gives it back to him, then gives money to Seth Andrews, who then gives it back to him. Then we've got the No Religion Required podcast, who gives money to the Atheism 101 podcast, who gives the money right back to them. And then they give it to A Matter of Doubt, who gives it right back to them. And then they give it to Team DeWitt, who gives it right back to them. Then we have Amy Davis Roth, the famous jewelry maker on the atheist speaking circuit, who does have the null transaction that we mentioned before with Rebecca Watson, but also has another one with Ashley F. Miller, one of the bloggers on Free Thought Blogs. Then we've got A Matter of Doubt, who has the aforementioned null transaction with the No Religion Required podcast. And then we have the Dark Matter 2525 channel, who's giving money back to the goddamn podcast after they've given money to him. And then we've got the Atheism 101 podcast, who's giving money to the No Religion Required podcast, who's giving it back to them. And then giving to the Waiting for Wrath podcast, who's giving money back to them. And then giving to Robert Ray, who's giving money back to them. And then Robert Ray is giving money to the Atheism 101 podcast, and goes back to him. He's also giving to a bunch of other people. Then we've got Ashley F. Miller from Free Thought Blogs, who's giving to Amy Davis Roth, who's giving it back to her, and then to Miri, who's also on Free Thought Blogs, who's also giving it back to her. I just showed you how the Waiting for Wrath podcast is giving back to the Atheism 101 podcast after they gave to them, and also how Miri is giving to Ashley Miller, who's giving back to her, and then she's giving to a bunch of other people. But we also have Dr. Christy Winters, who's giving to the Skeptic Feminist, and then the Skeptic Feminist is giving that money right back to her. In conclusion, I believe that my research shows, given the sample that I used and the circle jerk I just showed, that null transactions used to inflate each other's Patreon accounts to make each other look bigger and thereby draw in more money from your fans, is a tactic that is not used by MRAs and is only used by people who lean towards the social justice warrior or feminist side of politics.